Welcome back to our daily read aloud, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. We are really getting close to the end of the book. There are about 30 pages left, not even. So the last chapter was called The Escape. So we know that Mrs. Frisby was let out of the cage by Justin. They both got out of the house. They moved her house successfully, got it to the other side of the stone. And the last thing that was said to her, Arthur said, "Now you can put your children to bed. We'll take care of the rest." So they were going to cover it back over with dirt, fill in the old hole with all the dirt they dug out for the new hole to make sure Mr. Fitzgibbon doesn't know anything's been going on. Now, there is another huge problem, right? There is an exterminator coming to pump poisonous gas down into the rat's hole. Mrs. Frisby has warned the rats. They are aware, but they're going to have to change their plan, right? Their plan was to move to Thorn Valley and start their own civilization where they grew their own food and did everything for themselves without stealing. However, they still needed more time to get that ready, so they're going to have to leave sooner than they thought. All right, our next chapter is called At the Meeting. Mrs. Frisby slept well and soundly. The day just finished, having been the longest and hardest she had ever known. She awoke in the morning with a smile. Her house was warm, and it was safe at last. Her children slept peacefully beside her. Timothy's breathing was quiet and easy. They could stay in the house now as long as they needed to. On some warm day later in the spring, when Timothy was strong again, they would move to the summer house down by the brook. Another nice thing, she thought. When they left the house, she would close up the entrance tunnel so that no one could find it. Undisturbed by the plow, it would be ready and waiting for them in the fall. It could be theirs forever, thanks to the rats. The rats! In her half-dreaming state, she had forgotten. They were in terrible danger. What would they do? She felt as if she ought to go and offer to help them. But help how? She could think of nothing she could do. At that moment, she heard a voice calling her name from above. "Mrs. Frisby." She left the bed and went to the bottom of the entrance hole. "Yes, who's calling?" "It's me, Brutus. Can you come up?" Mrs. Frisby climbed up and out her front door, blinking in the early morning sunlight. "Nicodemus wants to know if you can come with me. He's having a meeting." "Just let me wake the children and tell them." 2 minutes later, she was walking with Brutus towards the rosebush. "What does Nicodemus want?" "It's about the men. Justin told us last night. Nicodemus thinks they may be from NIMH. He wants to ask you more about what Mr. Fitzgibbon said." That morning there were 2 rats on sentry duty, one just inside the entrance to the rosebush, watching Mr. Fitzgibbon's house, another at the arch where Brutus had stood. All of the rest were gathered in the large assembly room Mrs. Frisby had seen when she got off the elevator. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and 2 other rats sat on the raised platform at the end. The rest sat facing them, filling every square inch of floor space except for an aisle up the center. Mrs. Frisby had never seen so many rats. Even the young ones were present. She spotted Isabella, staring up at the platform with wide, round eyes. Some of the mothers held small babies at their sides. Most of them looked anxious. There was an air of tension, but none of panic. Brutus led her up the center aisle to the raised platform. There was a table on it, covered with papers, and one vacant space, where a chair had been placed for Mrs. Frisby. The rats waited in complete silence while she sat down. Then Nicodemus said, quite formally, Justin has told us all that happened. Mrs. Frisby, it seems you have more than repaid us for the help we gave you in moving your house. Just as your husband did once, you have saved us from disaster. Death or capture, we do not know yet which." Justin gave her a wink. Mrs. Frisby had a taste of capture herself last night. "Would you tell us, as well as you can remember it, word for word, what Mr. Fitzgibbon said about the rats, about the men who were at the store?" "As well as I can remember it." Mrs. Frisby's voice sounded small in the big room. "Mr. Fitzgibbon said a strange thing had happened at the hardware store. Henderson's, he called it." Her memory was good. She had listened with great care to what Mr. Fitzgibbon had said, and she was able to recall the whole conversation word for word. The rats sat quietly as she told it. Then Nicodemus went back over it, asking questions. You say that Mr. Fitzgibbon said 6 or 7 rats. Did he ever say which number it really was? No, I don't think he paid much attention to the number. Jenner's group was 7, said Justin, but it could be a coincidence. Did he say how far away from town where this happened, or did he name it? No, but it must not be very far. He'd been there and back that day. Did anyone see his car go out? Nicodemus asked the others. I heard it, Brutus said. I was on duty. It went after lunch. And he was back by dinner, but which direction? If we knew, we might send someone. You see, Nicodemus explained to Mrs. Frisby. We need to know who those men are. If they're from NIMH, things are much worse for us. We'd never make it, said Arthur. Driving at, say, 40 or 50 miles an hour, Mr. Fitzgibbon might have gone 15 or 20 miles in any direction, and returned easily the same afternoon. On the map, there was a road map on the table. You could see it could have been any one of the half-dozen small towns, and each of them might have a hardware store. You're right, of course, said Nicodemus. Without the name, that idea is hopeless. He turned back to Mrs. Frisby. Mr. Fitzgibbon said the rats were grouped around the motor as if they were trying to move it? That's what he said the store owner told him. He didn't see it himself. And that the motor was plugged in. Had been left plugged in, Mrs. Frisby quoted. But we don't know who plugged it in. I got the impression, said Mrs. Frisby, from the way he said it, that the store owner had left it plugged in, but I'm not sure. That would make sense, Arthur said. If it was Jenner, and if they had plugged it in themselves, they'd have known better than to try to move it. So they must not have realized. It was probably pretty dark in the store. Poor Jenner, said Nicodemus. I wish he had stayed with us. It will be poor us, said one of the rats at the table. Mrs. Frisby did not know his name. If we don't get on with this. He did not mention the doctor's name, Nicodemus said. Did he say even a word about what he looked like? No. Did he describe the truck at all? No, only that it was full of equipment. Are you sure about the headline in the local paper? Mechanized rats invade hardware store? I'm sure that's what Mr. Fitzgibbon said it was, but I don't think he saw it. He didn't say so. In a way, that's the most puzzling thing about the whole story, Nicodemus said. Why is that? Asked Justin. Because the headline doesn't really fit the facts. You don't call a bunch of dead rats mechanized just because you find them on a shelf near a motor. Maybe not, said the nameless rat. But then why did the newspaper say it? I'm wondering, Nicodemus said, if perhaps there wasn't more to the story. Some stronger reason to think they were really taking the motor away, or that they really knew how to use it. Maybe some other motors had been stolen, Justin said, or some tools. That would make them seem mechanized. It would, said Nicodemus. And it would explain what the doctor meant when he said they had more checking to do in town. They're looking for things that were missing, Arthur said, sounding suddenly worried. They're looking for Jenner's headquarters, and if they find it... We're just guessing, of course, Nicodemus said, but it's a possibility. And a bad one. It means, Nicodemus continued, that we have no choice. We've got to assume they're from NIMH. We've also got to assume that by now they may have found Jenner's headquarters, whatever cave or cavern they were using. And, said Justin, that now they're looking for us. Why for us? Asked one of the rats. Why wouldn't they think Jenner's group are the only ones? They might, Nicodemus admitted, but I don't think so. After all, they know that there were 20 of us originally. Why should there only be 7 now? And we already know that they're coming out here, in quite a hurry at that. So, if they're from NIMH, obviously they are looking for us. I think, said Arthur, that we've got to make some plans, and quickly. I agree, said Nicodemus. It's a new situation, and a tricky one. We won't be able to do everything we hope to. There isn't time. And somehow we have to convince the exterminators, when they come, that we aren't more of the mechanized rats they're looking for. We won't be able to move any more food to Thorn Valley, Nicodemus continued. We'll have to get along with what we've already got stored there. About an 18-month supply if we're careful. The seeds, I believe, are already moved. Yes, said Arthur. The last load went yesterday. So, with luck, we'll have our own first crop this summer and fall. We won't have time to destroy the motors or the books or the furniture as we planned. Instead, we'll move everything to the cave, and then we'll seal off all entrances to the cave as if it never existed." "That can be done," Arthur said. "But there's more. We've got to pull all the wires and lights from the tunnel. They're likely to dig it up. In the carpet, we've got to tear down the arch. Then, when all that's done, when everything is hidden in the cave, we'll fill in the stairway and the elevator shaft. We'll seal off everything except the upper storage room and the tunnels leading in the front and out the back. When they dig, they'll find that room. It's as big as an ordinary rat hole. Justin, tonight, take a group of a dozen or so. Go to the Fitzgibbons garbage can. Bring back a load of the worst-smelling garbage you can find. The storage room is going to become an ordinary, typical rat hole, not in the least mechanized or civilized." Nicodemus turned to Arthur. "What do you think?" "I think we can do it all. We won't get much sleep, though." Justin said, "But there's one more thing. Won't they think it's odd, especially if they're from NIMH, finding just an empty hole?" Nicodemus said, "I was coming to that." He sounded suddenly very tired. Tomorrow morning, as soon as it's light, the main group leaves for Thorn Valley. But some of us will have to stay behind. As Justin says, if they find just an empty hole, they're sure to be suspicious, and they'll keep on digging. So, when they come with their gas truck, they've got to find some rats here. A rear guard. I'd say at least 10. So think about what that means. What does it mean they're going to have to leave behind 10 rats? It's hard to know if they'll have a good chance of surviving, right? Mrs. Frisby walked slowly home, keeping to the edge of the woods, keeping out of sight. Justin had instantly volunteered for the rear guard. Brutus was second, and behind him 8 more. There were 50 more waiting behind them. "Enough, enough," said Nicodemus. Isabella, in tears, had run forward. "I want to stay. Please," she had pleaded, looking despairingly at Justin. "No children," said Nicodemus, and her mother led her away, still weeping. Those 10, the 10 who would remain, did not face certain death, nor certain capture. The exterminators, they presumed, would make noise, especially if they cleared away the rosebush. The rats would be alerted. When the men pumped gas as expected into the hole, the pump would also make a noise. The air below would move as the gas flowed in. When they felt that, the rats would scramble out the back exit, past the sealed-off cave, emerge as noisily as possible in the blackberry bramble. Indeed, show themselves, and dash off into the woods. But won't they block the rear exit? Or put a net over it? "We'll give them another rear exit to block," Arthur had said cryptically, "one that's easier to find." So it sounds like they're going to make a fake entrance exit hole to trick them. "Mother, why are you so quiet?" asked Teresa. They were sitting down to dinner for the first time in their newly moved house. "You seem sad." "I suppose I am," Mrs. Frisby said, "because the rats are all going away." "But that's no reason. It's true they moved our house, and that was nice of them, but we didn't really know them." "I was getting to know them pretty well." "Where are they going?" Cynthia asked. "To a new home, a long way away." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Will you go to see them off?" "I think I will." "But why are they moving away?" asked Timothy. "Because they want to," said Mrs. Frisby. Some day soon she would tell them the whole story, but not that night. All right, let's see here. I will read a little bit of this chapter, and then we'll stop in the middle and save the rest for tomorrow. All right, this chapter is called The Doctor. The next morning, Mr. Fitzgibbon started the larger of his 2 tractors, the huge one he kept in the barn, the one that pulled the combine in the fall harvest. With help from Paul and Billy, he bolted the big bulldozer blade to the front of it, rumbled it up through the barnyard gate, and stopped it near the rosebush. "We'll wait till they come," he said, turning off the engine. Mrs. Frisby could not bear to watch, and yet even more, she could not bear not to watch. She knew there was nothing to be gained by it, nothing she could do. Yet how could she stay at home when the 10 rats, including Justin and Brutus, were waiting bravely underground? She could not. She thought at first of her watch hole in the corner post. Then she decided against it. Nearer to the rose bush on the edge of the woods stood a hickory tree, its scaly bark like a ladder, inviting her to climb. 10 feet up on this tree, a large branch jutted straight out. On this branch, up close to the trunk, she had a vantage point from which, herself unseen, she could look down on the rose bush and see into the woods to the blackberry bramble, where though she had never been in it, she was sure the rat's rear exit must be hidden. She settled down to wait. It was a chilly morning, with a damp breeze and a gray mist that blew in by patches. Somewhere near the middle of the morning, a square white truck came into the driveway. Hold on. So we can make an inference, right? We've seen the square white truck before. It's from NIMH. A man in a white coverall uniform climbed out and knocked on the Fitzgibbons' door. It was too far away for Mrs. Frisby to hear the knock, or to hear what the man said when Mrs. Fitzgibbon came out on the porch. But 10 seconds later, Billy ran from the house to the barn, where Mr. Fitzgibbon was working. The man returned to the truck and waited, standing outside the open cab door. Through the windshield, she could see that 2 more men sat in the front seat, and that one of them wore horn-rimmed glasses. Now, Mr. Fitzgibbon approached the truck, Billy dancing beside him, apparently in some excitement. There was a conference, none of which Mrs. Frisby could hear, accompanied by gestures toward the rose bush and the waiting bulldozer. The man in white climbed back into the driver's seat and drove the truck across the grass. He backed it up beside the bulldozer, stopping perhaps 10 feet from the bush. Mrs. Frisby stared at it. If there was anything printed on it, it must be on the other side, away from her. Then 3 men climbed out, and she could hear what they said. "It's a big one, all right," said one of the men, "and look at those thorns. It's hard to see how even a rat could get in there." The man in the horn rims walked around the edge of the bush, examining it closely. He bent over. "Look at this," he said. "There's an entrance hole, very neatly hidden. And look behind it, a path leading in." He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had walked up with Billy. "You were right. You'll need to bulldoze it. It would take us all day to hack our way in there. But cut it off just at the surface if you can. If you dig too deep and open the hole, they'll get away." He added, "You'd better tell the boy to keep back. We'll be using cyanide, and it's dangerous." So cyanide is a type of poison gas. Billy, after some argument, was dispatched to the back porch, where Mrs. Fitzgibbon was also watching. One of the men had walked around to the far side of the bush, the side near Mrs. Frisby's tree. "Doc," he called, "there's another entrance in the bush, and there's a hole just inside it." Doc was the man in the horn rims. He was a doctor. Mrs. Frisby thought, Doctor somebody. He was in charge. "Can you get at it?" he asked. "Not very well. Too many thorns." The man who was a doctor walked around and looked at it. "No," he said. "Anyway, that would be the escape hatch. We'll find the main hole near the middle of the bush." He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who was mounted on the tractor. "Okay," said the doctor. "Can you push it that way, away from the shed?" Mr. Fitzgibbon nodded, and the motor started with a roar. He pulled a lever and flexed the heavy steel blade up and down, bringing the bottom edge to rest just even with the ground. The blade was fully 8 feet across. He pulled another lever. The wheels, with cleated tires as tall as windows, dug in, and the blade scraped forward. The bush fought back, then yielded angrily, snapping and crackling before the thrust of steel. A single sweep, and a third of it lay, a writhing heap of thorns, in a pile 20 feet away. The ground trembled under the wheels, and Mrs. Frisby thought of the 10 rats huddled below. Supposing the weight collapsed the earth, caved in the storage room, and trapped them. Another sweep, and a third. Only a thorny stubble now stood where the bush had been. On the porch, Mrs. Fitzgibbon covered her eyes with her hands, and Billy cheered in excitement. Plainly exposed were 2 holes, simple, round rat holes. There was no trace of the small mound nor the elegant arched entrance. Arthur had done his work thoroughly. Mrs. Frisby wondered for a moment at the second hole. Then she remembered his saying, "We'll give them another rear exit to block." Of course. They had dug another hole most likely, she thought. Just a dummy leading nowhere. The men in the white suits went into action. The back doors of the truck were opened, and a long, flexible pipe unrolled. It looked like a fire hose, except that at the end, instead of a nozzle, there was a round plunger, like a big rubber ball cut in half. One of the men donned a mask with a glass visor and a tube that ran to a pack on his back, a gas mask. The masked man pulled the hose over to the center rat hole and pressed the plunger over it, covering it completely. From the back of the truck, the other two took a large box made of wood and wire, almost a yard wide, and placed it over the second hole. It was a cage, but half its bottom was a trap door, neatly mounted on hinges. This they raised, placing the opening part directly over the opening in the earth. Then they backed away, one of them holding a tripcord which would close the trap door after the rats were inside. "All set?" the doctor called to the man in the mask. The mask nodded. "Keep back now," the doctor said to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had left his tractor to watch. He walked to the truck, reached inside, and turned a switch. Mrs. Frisby heard the soft throb of a pump. Now. She turned and watched the blackberry bramble in the woods. Would they hear the pump? Where were they? Oh, let them come out. Almost a minute passed. The men in white watched the trap. Nothing moved. Then she saw it. Behind the bramble, half hidden by a swirl of mist, a gray-brown shape, a rat, shaking dirt from his ears. Another, then 3 more. They huddled in silence, waiting. More. How many? 10? 7. Only 7. Where were the other 3? Still they waited. Then, as if by agreement, they stopped waiting. They ran, all 7 of them, not back into the woods to safety, but out of the woods, toward the stubble of the rose bush, toward the men. At the edge of the bush, they stopped as if in confusion, ran to the left, ran to the right, then fled back into the woods again. Now, they were out of sight of the men, but not of Mrs. Frisby. Instantly, they regrouped behind the blackberry bramble and charged out again, but this time in smaller numbers, first 2, then 3, then 2 again. She saw what they were up to. They were not in the least confused. They were making 7 rats look like 20 rats, or 40, a steady stream of them. In the mist, in the hectic turning, running, turning, hiding, she could not tell whether she recognized any of them. The men shouted, "Look at that! A pack of them!" "How did they get out? Get the nets!" The doctor turned off the pump. The man with the hose pulled off his mask, and a new wave of rats danced along the edge of the clearing. All 3 men ran to the truck, and from it pulled long-handled nets. But Mrs. Frisby, up on her branch, was staring at the blackberry bush again. She saw something that all the others, including the rats, did not see. An 8th rat had come out. He emerged running, but then he stumbled. He got up and ran again, this time more slowly, circling vaguely to the right. He did not seem to know where he was going. He reached a sparse thicket of saplings, almost out of sight, and there, abruptly, he fell over on his side and lay still. Meanwhile, all 3 men, holding their nets low, ran across the stubble toward the parade of rats. But as they approached the parade, it vanished. The rats, their purpose accomplished, melted into the misty woods, and this time they did not reappear. Mrs. Frisby watched them as they loped away swiftly in single file and disappeared from her view, back into the deep forest and up the mountainside. The rear guard was gone, bound for Thorn Valley. But the 8th rat still lay unmoving along the saplings, and 2 had never come out at all. "They're gone," said the man who had worn the mask. "They fooled us." "What happened?" asked Mr. Fitzgibbon, standing near the truck. "Simple enough," said the doctor. "They had 2 escape holes, and they used the other one." He had walked back to the blackberry bramble and bent down, kicking the branches aside with his foot. "Here it is," he said. "Quite a long tunnel, one of the longest I've seen." To the other men, he said, "Get the pick and the shovels." For half an hour they dug, laying open a narrow trench along the tunnel. From her angle of view in the tree, Mrs. Frisby could see only the top of this trench and not down into the bottom. Still, she watched, saying to herself, Perhaps after all they were only 8. Maybe they decided that 8 would be enough. Then one of the shovels broke through into air. They had come to the rats' storage room. "There's 2 of them," said one of the men, and her heart sank. Who were they? She wanted to run and look, but she did not dare. "Careful," said the doctor. "There may still be some gas in there. Let the wind blow it out." "Phew," said one of the men. "That's not gas. That's garbage." "Open it up a little more," said the doctor. One of the men wielded his shovel for another minute, and then let the doctor peer in. "Garbage," he said. "Last night's dinner. Garbage and 2 dead rats," Mrs. Frisby thought. He sounded disappointed. "Only 2?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Yes, it's easy to see what happened. In this hole this size, there would have been a couple of dozen at least. But these 2 must have been up at the front, near the tunnel. They got a whiff of the gas, and it killed them. But before they died, they must have warned the others. So the rest ran out." "Warned them?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Could they do that?" "Yes," said the doctor. "They're intelligent animals. Some can do a great deal more than that." But he did not elaborate. Instead, he turned to one of the men. "We might as well take these 2 back with us." All right, and I am going to stop there. All right, so tomorrow we will find out which rats made it out. We'll find out if they made it to Thorn Valley, and we will see if Mrs. Frisby and her family ever get to move to their summer house at the brook. But tomorrow will be our last day in the story. See you then.